Hi everyone, this is Nikki Jameson here, and today we are in Corel Painter 2023, or rather Painter 2023, and I'm going to do a bit of an exploration with some of Corel Painter's watercolor brushes. So typically we've done a lot of watercolor painting and brushes in Rebelle, and we haven't looked at the ones in Corel Painter. They're not as well known, but Corel Painter actually has three or more types of watercolor. It's got watercolor fringe, watercolor pigment, and watercolor real watercolor. So we're going to look at the watercolor pigment, and what I'm going to do is go on the brushes. I'm going to go on this flat soft, and the way I'm going to do this, because it's quite easy to sort of do a whole watercolor painting with strokes, but what I've been doing is exploring some of the properties of the watercolor, and I've done that by creating a selection, which you will see here. So I will just paint within the selection boxes, and for the purposes of this video I've just done 4 on this canvas. This is an 8 by 12 canvas, and I've just done 4 selections on that page. I find that this actually reduces the friction in a way, in that if you're only painting within a smaller space, it's far easier to kind of look at the attributes and do your painting, and maybe it will become the basis of a painting later. So because I've picked the watercolor pigments brush category, which is part of Painter, the software's added a watercolor layer, which you can see here, and that's the layer I'm going to paint on. Now, before I do that, I'm actually going to reset this brush. This is not my main favorite of the brushes, but I want to start with this one. I'm going to reset the brush, and I'm also going to change the paper, because with the watercolor brushes you get a very different stroke depending on the paper you use. One of the papers I like to use is this paper group called Heavy Gesso, or Gesso I think it is. These are some papers that I acquired from Painter. Painter has a lot of different papers that I've mentioned before. This is a very good opportunity to play with some papers and just see what Corel does. So let me bring those up, if I can find them again. Textured, gesso, and watercolor. Now, I think I got these within Corel Painter, but I am not sure. And you can always create papers as well. Maybe we'll do a video on that some other time. So I'm going to pick this first paper, and you'll see in here that the paper preview changes. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick just a color in my color wheel, and I'm going to just make some marks. Okay. Now this brush this is not a grainy brush, and it's at a small size, so I like to increase these brushes, because in their default a lot of them come out quite small. But you can see it's going over into the other selection. But if I make that a little bit larger, you can see the brush strokes. So that's a flat soft. Let me just find another brush that I know is a little bit. I'm going to try this one called Grainy Wash, because I know, I'll just reset it, I know that actually really has a little bit more of a flow. So if you see what's happening here, we're getting a nice kind of flow with this particular brush. Let's choose a darker color here, and I kind of like that. You can imagine if this was a bigger space that I was painting on, I would get more space, but I want to keep it contained, just as if I'm doing a very small abstract. Okay, so you can see that the paint is flowing in a really nice way, and that's with this paper, and this paper is called Cracked Gesso. I'm going to actually pick this one called Peppered Watercolor, and you'll be able to see the difference Let's use a blue up there since we're higher up. You can see the difference here. In fact, that's kind of like a lot of water. And on that point, one of the things you can do with these watercolor brushes is that you can change the attributes. If you look along the top bar, you will see attributes of these brushes. So the grain refers to the paper, the opacity refers to the paint, or the paint stroke. So it's got an opacity of 50%. This little layered thing here is if I want to dry the watercolor layer. So if I dry the watercolor layer, it will immediately stop flowing until I paint again. And I can also control the wetness. It's 800% here, which makes it very, very wet. I can turn that down if I want, and the diffusion amount is 95, so it's pretty high here. And if I click on this little watercolor button here, this is where I can actually change some of those attributes again that we've just talked about. So you've got some options. You can actually open this flyout. You can also delay the diffusion until after you've painted your strokes. Gives you a bit more control. And the wind force is actually how it's like how far the water flows and the way the water flows. So if I reduce that, it still flows, but it's a little bit slower. Okay, so this is our first one with this paper, and I kind of like this paper. I think it's really nice. And when you find a paper, I'm going to pick another color here, and I'm just going to, so you can actually see it, how this flows. Let me just make that a wee bit bigger. And we're still on the one watercolor layer. So you can get some really interesting abstracts or abstract shapes with this. And I like the way the strokes flow into each other. Now, if you want to reduce the paper grain, I made it 20 there. You can reduce it to about 12%. And so I get less of a paper grain effect and more of the watercolor effect, which is pretty nice. So a lot of water flow here, but you can control it. So if you like something really wet, you can you can control that. You might not like the grain texture being picked up, but I kind of like that. Okay, so this is just one brush called Grainy Wash that I'm using here, but if I use it with different paper, you can see that I will get some quite nice paint marks. So if we pick, say, I picked a different paper here, and this paper is called Scrambled Gesso. And look at that. That's just really, I think that's really lovely. I don't know about you, but I really like this. If your canvas is too large, or you have it at a very high DPI, it actually can slow the watercolor down. I'm just going to actually save this. I'm going to save it as a RIF file. And I'm going to call this. Really nice flow here. We don't often see enough of these. If I wanted to paint in, let's say, a horizon, I could use a different brush, say a dry brush, and just make a mark across. Okay, and one of the other things you can do with this, you can't actually blend as much, okay, but you can use, I'm going to use another brush called Mixer here. I'm just going through the brushes, and it mixes some of the paint strokes. Now bear in mind, I'm still exploring these brushes, and the more I explore them, the more nuggets I find. So I'm just going to undo some of those strokes. Take that out because I don't really want that. The other thing you can do is you can also add wetting agents. So it's like adding additional liquid or wetness to the canvas. And it also does have a diffusion and a flow. You can dry the canvas and it will cease flowing. And then when you paint again, I'm going to put in another color here. Oops, you need to take it off the wetting agent and go back to a brush. So let's say this flat wash. And you'll see where I put the wetting agent, it's given a defined paint area which flows into the paint. Okay, one other thing that you may or may not notice here is that whenever you add a watercolor layer for these brushes, it automatically adds a gel blend mode to it. So the composite method is going to be gel. Okay, so that's an important thing. It always happens, and if you try and turn it to something like normal, actually that's not actually bad for this one for some reason, but oftentimes when I turn it to normal, or let's say overlay, well, overlay will make it disappear altogether. So normal is actually not too bad, but it's a bit lighter. Okay, so I'm going to put it back to gel for now and leave it as it is, but get some really interesting flows here which you actually can control. So put some white there. Okay, and here I'm just pressing Alt and sampling the color. So it's actually picking up quite a bit of the paper grain here, and so it's giving me this nice impact. Now all the brushes have different attributes here. Okay, so not all of them even have the paper grain. Some of them you can attach you can use a flow map, but as you see with this one, it's more, it doesn't have as much, it doesn't have the paper grain options to change the grain as the previous one did. And that one I'm using a flat wash, not a grainy wash. The grainy wash will always bring up the paper but grain, because you can change the paper. Okay, paper refers to the grain. Okay, so let's choose another brush called Runny. So I'm going to do almost the same thing, and I'm going to choose another paper. Let's choose, we've got speckled, streaky gesso, swooshed, textured. That might be a nice one. There's just so many nice papers here. Watercolor 3. Let's try this watercolor 3. See what we get. We've used some gesso, so let's try another one. What could we do here? I'm going to choose this kind of darkish green. Oh, I didn't reset this brush. Let's just reset it. So the brush in its default is quite small, but you can see as soon as I start painting, it starts its flow. Okay. So why don't I make the brush a bit bigger? Got the opacity of 100, the wetness of 937, diffusion amount is 91%, and feature, which is the stroke feature, is 9.1. I'm going to leave that as it is, and just put in a few marks here. And I'm going to try and mix these marks just to see what they do. So you can see it's picking up the paper grain here. Even though this is not a grainy brush, it's more of a wash. You can see some really, really nice flow into the paper. Now it's quite contained here. That's another advantage of using a selection. But this is a really good way I found to explore what these brushes can do. Okay, so you can see in some cases it's actually flowing outside the selection box. Okay, so this brush is called Flat Wash, And what I've just done here is this, I've just really picked this. I'm going to lessen the diffuse amount here. And you'll see it's just a little bit slower to diffuse out if I do that, which is something that if you want to slow down the diffusion amount, then you can absolutely do that. But this is really quite neat, and it's using this paper called Watercolour 3. So having done these 4 little mini landscapes with these brushes, we're going to leave this here, and I'm going to do part 2 where we're going to look at some more watercolor brushes and some more papers, and we're going to see what interesting marks and paintings we can get in those paintings with other brushes. So I'll see you in the second part of this video. Hope you've learned something in this part of it, and hopefully I will see you in the next part of this video.